A millionaire is humiliated while pretending to be poor, but when they see her in a luxury car, no one can believe it. The sun filtered through the silk curtains of Victoria Morgan's bedroom, heiress to the Morgan Empire, one of the most powerful business conglomerates in the United States. At 22 years old, Victoria had it all: beauty, intelligence, an elite education, and a fortune most could only dream of. However, as she watched the sunrise over New York City from her luxury penthouse, she felt an inexplicable emptiness in her heart. "Is this really what I want for my life?" she wondered, aloud, her voice barely a whisper. In the empty room Victoria had spent the last few months debating internally. The extravagant parties, private jet trips, and society magazine covers no longer satisfied her. She yearned for something more, something real. With determination in her hazel eyes, she made a decision that would change her life forever. She was going to leave everything behind: her name, her fortune, her identity. She wanted to discover who she really was, without the weight of the Morgan name on her shoulders. That same afternoon, while the Morgan family prepared for a charity gala, Victoria packed a bag with essentials. She left her phone, credit cards, and everything that could link her to her previous life. She only took some cash and fake documents she had secretly obtained before leaving. She wrote a note for her parents: "Mom, Dad, don't worry about me. I need to find myself, to discover who I really am without the weight of our last name. I promise I'll be okay, and that I'll come back when I'm ready. I love you, Victoria." With her heart pounding, she left through the service door, avoiding the security guards. For the first time in her life, she walked the city streets without a retinue of bodyguards. She felt free and terrified at the same time. That night, she took an overnight bus to Chicago. During the journey, Victoria transformed herself. She cut her long brown hair and dyed it a darker shade. When she arrived in Chicago at dawn, she was no longer Victoria Morgan, the millionaire heiress. Now she was Sophie Henderson, an ordinary student looking to start a new life. Sophie rented a small apartment in a student neighborhood and enrolled at the University of Chicago to study social sciences, a major her parents would never have approved of. The first few days were a culture shock for her. Used to having everything done her way, she now had to deal with public transportation, cooking her own meals, and managing a limited budget. On her first day of classes, Sophie sat at the back of the classroom trying to go unnoticed. Next to her, a girl with curly hair and thick-rimmed glasses smiled at her. "Hi, I'm Lucy." The girl introduced herself. "Are you new too?" Sophie nodded, surprised by Lucy's spontaneous kindness. "Yes, I just moved to Chicago," she replied with a shy smile. Lucy turned out to be a charming classmate and soon became Sophie's first real friend. Through Lucy, Sophie met other students: Jack, an aspiring writer with a charismatic personality; Emma, an activist passionate about social causes; and Alex, a mysterious student who seemed to keep his own secrets. While Sophie adapted to her new life in New York City, Victoria Morgan's disappearance was causing a stir. Headlines speculated about her whereabouts, and her devastated parents offered $1 million reward for information about their daughter. In Chicago, oblivious to the chaos she had left behind, Sophie began to flourish. For the first time in her life, she felt valued for who she was, not for what she had. Her new friends appreciated her for her intelligence and sense of humor, not for her last name or bank account. However, Sophie's life was not without challenges. In an economics class, the professor assigned a group project on major American companies. Sophie's group decided to research Morgan Enterprises. "Have you heard about the missing heiress?" Jack asked as they researched. "They say she ran off with a secret lover." Sophie felt her blood run cold. I don't follow those news much," she mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Emma chimed in. "It's a shame. With all those resources, she could be doing something useful for the world instead of living like a spoiled princess." Emma's words felt like a slap to Sophie. Was that the perception the world had of Victoria Morgan? A spoiled and useless princess? Guilt and doubt began to creep into her mind. Meanwhile, in the headquarters of Morgan Enterprises, a shadowy figure watched the city from an office on the top floor. Richard Wallace, vice president of the company and right-hand man to the Morgan family, smiled with satisfaction as he read reports about Victoria's disappearance. "Everything is going according to plan," he muttered to himself. "Soon Morgan Enterprises will be mine." What no one knew was that Richard had orchestrated Victoria's disappearance. He had planted seeds of doubt in her mind for months, subtly manipulating her to question her place in the world. Now, with the heiress out of the way, his plan to take control of the company was in motion. Back in Chicago, Sophie immersed herself in her studies and her new social circle, trying to ignore the guilt she felt for abandoning her family. One night, while studying in the library with Lucy, she noticed Alex watching her intently from another table. Intrigued and a little uneasy, Sophie approached him. "Is there something you want to tell me?" she asked directly. Alex seemed surprised by her frankness. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he replied. "It's just that there's something about you that seems familiar." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Had he recognized her? But Alex continued. "You have a look as if you're carrying a big secret. I know because I have one too." Sophie didn't know how to respond. For a moment, she considered confessing everything to Alex, but fear held her back. Instead, she offered him an enigmatic smile. "We all have secrets, don't we?" As the weeks passed, Sophie found herself increasingly attracted to Alex. There was something about his demeanor, his penetrating gaze, and his aura of mystery that intrigued her deeply. At the same time, her friendship with Lucy strengthened, and Sophie began to feel that she finally had a true best friend. However, the peace of her new life was about to be disturbed. One afternoon, while walking across campus, Sophie bumped into a familiar face that left her frozen. Jason Miller, son of an old associate of her father and Victoria's eternal rival in New York's social circles. Jason stared at her, with a mixture of surprise and suspicion in his eyes. "Victoria, is that you?" Sophie felt the world stop around her. With her heart racing, she managed to compose a confused smile. "I'm sorry, I think you're confusing me with someone else. My name is Sophie." Jason narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced. "That's curious. You look a lot like someone I know, someone who's been in the news lately." "It must be a coincidence," Sophie replied, struggling to stay calm. "I have one of those faces, I guess." Before Jason could press her further, Lucy suddenly appeared, saving the situation. "Sophie, I've been looking for you. We have to go. We'll be late for the conference." Grateful for the interruption, Sophie quickly said goodbye to Jason and walked away with Lucy. As they walked, Sophie couldn't help but look back, only to see Jason watching her with a calculating expression. That night, in her small apartment, Sophie couldn't sleep. The encounter with Jason had shaken the foundations of her new life. What if they discovered her? What if everything she had worked for over the last few months crumbled? While Sophie dealt with her fears in New York City, Richard Wallace took another step in his master plan. In a secret meeting with the board of directors of Morgan Enterprises, he sowed doubts about the Morgans' ability to lead the company in their daughter's absence. "Gentlemen," he said in a soft but firm voice, "I understand we're in a delicate situation. Victoria's disappearance has left a void in the company, but we must think about the future. Can we afford to let the Morgans' emotional instability affect our business?" The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard continued, "I propose that, temporarily, we assume greater control over daily operations. For the good of the company, of course." While the gears of conspiracy moved in New York City and Chicago, Sophie faced new challenges. The project on Morgan Enterprises was reaching its final phase, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for her to hide her inside knowledge of the company. During a group study session, Emma commented, "It's fascinating how these big companies operate. I wonder what it would be like to grow up in that world." Sophie couldn't contain herself. "It's not as glamorous as it seems," she said, before she could stop herself. "I mean, I imagine there must be a lot of pressure and expectations." Jack looked at her curiously. "You talk as if you knew it firsthand." Feeling she had put her foot in her mouth, Sophie tried to fix it. "Oh, it's just what I've read in articles and stuff. You know, there are always stories about the children of the rich and famous, Alex." who had been quiet until then, chimed in. Sometimes appearances can be deceiving. We never really know what someone is going through on the inside. His words resonated deeply with Sophie, and for a moment their gazes met with an intensity that left her breathless. Did Alex suspect something, or was he just projecting his own secrets? As the semester progressed, Sophie found herself increasingly torn between her new life and the weight of her past. On one hand, she was flourishing academically, making true friends, and discovering parts of herself she had never explored. On the other, the guilt of abandoning her family and the constant threat of being discovered ate away at her. One night, while having dinner with Lucy at a small restaurant near campus, her friend surprised her with an unexpected question. "Sophie, you know you can trust me, right?" Lucy said, looking at her intensely. "I feel like there's something weighing on you, something you're not telling us." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. For a moment, she considered telling Lucy everything, but the fear of losing the friendship they had built held her back. "I'm fine, Lucy," she replied with a forced smile. "I'm just a little stressed about the final exams." Lucy didn't seem convinced, but she didn't push further. "Just remember that I'm here for you no matter what." Meanwhile, in the shadows, a figure observed the scene with interest. It was Jason Miller, who since his encounter with Sophie had been closely following her movements. Convinced that there was more to Sophie Henderson's story, Jason had decided to investigate on his own. What Sophie didn't know was that Jason wasn't acting alone. Behind his investigation was Richard Wallace's hand, who had hired Jason to locate Victoria. Richard's plan depended on keeping the Morgan heiress out of the game long enough to consolidate his power in the company. As the semester came to an end, events began to accelerate. At an end-of-term party, Sophie finally allowed herself to relax and enjoy, dancing and laughing with her friends. It was in that moment of carelessness that Jason made his move. Climbing onto the small stage where the band was playing, Jason took the microphone. "Attention everyone, I have an announcement to make. Among us, there's someone who isn't who they claim to be." Sophie's heart stopped. She watched as Jason pointed at her in the crowd. "That girl over there, the one calling herself Sophie Henderson, is actually Victoria Morgan, the missing heiress of the Morgan Empire." A deathly silence fell over the party. All eyes turned to Sophie, who felt the world crumbling around her. Lucy, Jack and Emma looked at her with a mixture of shock and disbelief, but it was Alex's gaze, a mix of understanding and something else she couldn't decipher, that hurt the most. I... Sophie tried to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. Before she could react, camera flashes from phones began to explode around her. Her secret, her new life. Everything was vanishing before her eyes. In an instant, Sophie felt someone grab her arm. It was Alex. "Come with me," he whispered urgently. Without thinking twice, Sophie followed him, escaping from the now murmuring and pointing crowd. Alex guided her through the university hallways until they reached a hidden small garden. Once there, Sophie broke down, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to lie. I just..." "Shh." Alex calmed her, surprising her with a hug. "You don't have to explain anything to me. I think I understand you better than you think." Sophie looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Alex took a deep breath. "Because I'm also hiding who I really am. My real name is Andrew Grayson. I'm the son of Charles Grayson, the CEO of Innovatech." The revelation hit Sophie like lightning. Innovatech was one of Morgan Enterprise's main competitors. But why? "For the same reasons as you, I guess," Andrew responded with a sad smile. "I wanted to know who I was. Without the weight of my last name, I wanted to be valued for myself, not for my family's money." At that moment, Sophie felt a connection with Andrew that went beyond anything she had experienced before. Here was someone who could truly understand her struggle, her fears, her hopes. But before they could delve deeper into their conversation, the sound of approaching footsteps alerted them. Lucy appeared in the garden, her face a mix of emotions. "Sophie, or should I say, Victoria," Lucy said, her voice trembling slightly. "Is it true? All this time you've been—" Sophie nodded, unable to look her friend in the eye. "I'm sorry, Lucy, I never meant to deceive you. You've been the best friend I've ever had, and everything we shared was real. Please believe me." Lucy remained silent for a moment that seemed eternal. Finally, to Sophie's surprise, she approached and hugged her. "You fool!" Lucy muttered. "I don't care if you're Sophie, Victoria, or the Queen of England. You're my friend, and that's all that matters." The relief Sophie felt was indescribable. However, she knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. Meanwhile, in New York City, Richard Wallace received the news of Victoria's identity revelation with a mixture of frustration and calculated calm. His plan had suffered a setback, but he wasn't defeated yet. "Jason," he spoke on the phone, "I want you to keep a close eye on Victoria. Don't lose sight of her. And remember, no one should know about my involvement in this." Back in Chicago, Sophie, Andrew, and Lucy discussed their next steps. The news of Sophie's true identity was spreading, like wildfire, and they knew that soon the media would descend on the university like vultures. "I need to face this," Sophie said with determination. "I can't keep running. I have to go back to New York and face my family, the company, everything." Andrew looked at her with admiration. "You don't have to do it alone, I'll go with you." "And so will I," Lucy added without hesitation. Sophie felt a wave of gratitude towards her friends. For the first time since she had left her old life, she felt she had the strength to face whatever came. That night, as they prepared to leave for New York City, Sophie received an unexpected call. It was Emma. "Victoria or Sophie, or whatever you want me to call you," Emma began, her voice a mixture of confusion and determination. "I don't know why you did what you did, but I know you're a good person, and I think you have a unique opportunity to do something really important with your position. If you need help fighting injustices from within the system, count me in." Emma's words resonated deeply with Sophie. Perhaps this was the purpose she had been searching for all this time. The next morning, Sophie, Andrew, and Lucy boarded a train to New York City. As the city of Chicago faded into the distance, Sophie reflected on everything she had gained and lost in the last few months. Her search for authenticity had led her down a path she never would have imagined, and now she was about to face the consequences of her actions. What Sophie didn't know was that, in the shadows, several forces were moving. Richard Wallace was preparing his final move to take control of Morgan. Enterprise's Jason Miller, motivated by a mixture of resentment and ambition, planned to use the information he had about Sophie for his own benefit. And somewhere between New York City and Chicago, a mysterious figure watched the events with great interest, waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth that would change everything. As the train headed towards the capital, Sophie looked at Andrew and Lucy, her allies in this new battle that was about to begin. With a mixture of fear and determination, she realized that her true journey of self-discovery was just beginning. The train glided smoothly along the rails, drawing ever closer to New York City. Sophie Henderson, or rather Victoria Morgan, looked out the window with a mixture of anxiety and determination. Beside her, Andrew Grayson, formerly known as Alex, and Lucy watched her with concern. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Andrew asked, gently taking Victoria's hand. She nodded, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. "I have to be. I've been running for too long. It's time to face the consequences of my actions." As the New York City skyline began to take shape on the horizon, Victoria remembered the last time she had seen those familiar towers and skyscrapers. It seemed a lifetime ago, when she was a privileged young heiress with no idea of what she really wanted in life. The train finally stopped at the station. As they disembarked, Victoria was surprised not to see a horde of journalists waiting for her. Apparently, her return was not yet public knowledge. "Where do we go now?" Lucy asked, looking around in awe. She had never been to the Big Apple before. "Home," Victoria replied with a sigh. "It's time to face my family." They took a taxi to the exclusive Upper East Side, where the Morgan mansion was located. During the journey, Victoria noticed how the city had changed in her absence, or perhaps it was she who had changed her way of seeing it. Upon arriving at the imposing wrought iron gate of the Morgan mansion, Victoria felt her heart racing. She took a deep breath and pressed the intercom. "Yes?" replied a familiar voice. It was Martha, the housekeeper who had raised her since she was a child. "Martha, it's me, Victoria, I'm back." There was a moment of stunned silence before the gate opened with a buzz. Victoria, Andrew, and Lucy entered the well-manicured gardens of the mansion. Before they could reach the main door, it swung open. "Victoria!" cried Isabel Morgan, running towards her daughter with tears in her eyes. She wrapped her in a fierce hug, as if fearing she might disappear again at any moment. Behind Isabel appeared Frederick Morgan, the family patriarch. His face was a mask of contained emotions, relief, joy, but also clear disappointment and anger. "Dad," Victoria began, but Frederick raised a hand to silence her inside. He said firmly, "We have a lot to talk about." Once in the luxurious living room of the mansion, an uncomfortable silence took over the atmosphere. Victoria briefly introduced Andrew and Lucy. Explaining that they were friends who had supported and accompanied her on her return, Frederick Morgan paced back and forth, his frustration evident in every step. Finally, he stopped and looked at his daughter. "Do you have any idea what you've caused?" he asked, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "The company has been in chaos, shareholders are nervous, and your mother and I have been sick with worry." Victoria lowered her gaze, guilt weighing on her. "I'm sorry, Dad, I never meant to cause so much pain, I just needed to find myself." Isabel approached her daughter, taking her hand. "Honey, why didn't you tell us how you felt? We could have found a solution together." "Because I didn't even know how I felt myself," Victoria replied. "I needed to get out of this bubble, see the real world, understand who I am without the Morgan name." Frederick snorted in disbelief. "And did you discover it? Was it worth risking everything our family has worked for generations?" Before Victoria could respond, the butler entered the room. "Sir, Mr. Wallace is here. He says it's urgent." Frederick frowned. "Show him in." Moments later, Richard Wallace entered the living room, his face a mask of professional concern. However, when he saw Victoria, a flash of something dark crossed his eyes, so quick that no one else noticed. "Victoria," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "what a joy to see you back. You've had us all very worried." Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. There had always been something about Richard that made her uncomfortable. Although she had never been able to explain why Richard has been invaluable during your absence, Frederick explained. "He's kept the company afloat amidst all this uncertainty." Wallace made a gesture of false modesty. "I've only done my job, sir. But now that Victoria has returned, I suppose things will get back to normal, won't they?" Victoria straightened up, feeling it was time to take the reins of the situation. "Actually, I have some ideas on how we can improve Morgan Enterprises' operations. My time away has given me a new perspective on our impact on society." Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Victoria's sudden assertiveness. "Fascinating. I'm sure we'll all be eager to hear your ideas." Frederick looked at his daughter with a mixture of surprise and reluctant pride. "Well, you've certainly changed, Victoria. But remember, running a company of this size is not a game. It requires experience and knowledge." "I know, Dad," Victoria replied, "and I'm ready to learn. But I also believe it's time for Morgan Enterprises to evolve. We can be more than just a company seeking profits. We can be a force for positive change." As tension in the room grew, Andrew decided to intervene. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, I know you're surprised and maybe disappointed, but I can assure you that during the time I knew Victoria in Chicago, she demonstrated extraordinary intelligence and compassion. I believe she has a lot to offer your company and society." Lucy nodded in agreement. "It's true, Victoria, or Sophie as we knew her, was always thinking about how to help others even when she had very little herself." Isabel looked at her daughter's friends gratefully. "Thank you for taking care of our Victoria. And thank you for bringing her back home." Frederick, however, remained skeptical. "All this sounds very noble, but the reality of business is much more complicated. We can't simply change the course of a multi-billion-dollar company based on youthful ideals." "Maybe not overnight," Victoria conceded, "but we can start making gradual changes. I have concrete ideas on how we can improve our labor practices, reduce our environmental impact, and contribute more significantly to the communities where we operate. Richard, who had been observing the exchange with growing unease, decided it was time to intervene. All this sounds very interesting, Victoria, but perhaps we should discuss it in a formal board meeting. After all, there are protocols to follow. Victoria noticed the condescending tone in Richard's voice and decided it was time to show that she was no longer the naive young woman who had left the mansion months ago. Of course, Richard, I'll be delighted to present my proposals to the board. In fact, why don't we schedule that meeting for tomorrow? I'm sure everyone will be eager to hear what I have to say. Richard's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Tomorrow might be a bit rushed, but I'll do my best to arrange it. Frederick looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Victoria, are you sure you're ready for this? You've been away for a long time. I'm more than ready, Dad, Victoria replied, with determination. It's time for me to take on my responsibilities, but on my own terms. As tension in the room grew, Andrew and Lucy exchanged worried glances. They knew Victoria was about to face forces much more powerful and dangerous than she had ever faced in Chicago. That night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Victoria found herself unable to sleep. She went out to the balcony of her old room, looking at the lights of the city she had once wanted to leave behind. Andrew found her there, wrapped in her thoughts. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Victoria turned to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and fear. "I don't know. Everything is happening so fast. A few days ago, my biggest concern was passing my final exams. Now, I'm about to face a board of directors and possibly change the course of a multi-billion-dollar company." Andrew took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You're not alone in this, Victoria. Lucy and I are here to support you, and from what I've seen, you're stronger and more capable than you think." Victoria smiled, grateful for his presence. "Thank you, Andrew. I don't know what I'd do without you two." As they shared that moment of intimacy, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from the shadows of the garden. Jason Miller, hidden among the bushes, was taking photos with a long-range camera. His face twisted into a grimace of disgust as he saw the closeness between Victoria and Andrew. "Enjoy while you can, Victoria," he muttered to himself. "Soon you'll discover that the real world is much crueler than you imagine." The next morning, Victoria woke up early, determined to prepare for the meeting with the board of directors. As she had breakfast with her family, Andrew and Lucy, the atmosphere was charged with tension and expectation. Frederick Morgan, who had spent the night reflecting on his daughter's return, finally spoke. "Victoria, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. Although I still have my reservations, I'm willing to listen to your ideas, but remember, the responsibility you're taking on is enormous." Victoria nodded, grateful for the opportunity. "I know, Dad, and I promise I won't disappoint you." Just as they were finishing breakfast, Martha, the housekeeper, hurriedly entered the dining room. "Sir, ma'am, you need to see this," she said, turning on the TV in the living room. On the screen appeared a morning news show, and Victoria's heart stopped when she saw her own image on the screen. The presenter spoke in a sensationalist tone. "In a surprising twist, the missing heiress Victoria Morgan has returned to New York City. Sources close to the family claim she spent the last few months living under a false identity in Chicago. But that's not all we have. Exclusive images that suggest a secret romance that could shake the foundations of the Morgan Empire." The image changed to a blurry but recognizable photograph of Victoria and Andrew on the balcony the night before, holding hands. Who is this mysterious young man, and how will this affect the future of Morgan Enterprises? Stay tuned for more details on this developing story. The silence that followed in the dining room was deafening. Frederick turned off the TV with an abrupt gesture and turned to his daughter, his face a mask of contained fury. "Explain yourself, Victoria." Now, Victoria, feeling that control of the situation was slipping out of her hands, looked at Andrew for support. He nodded slightly, giving her the strength she needed. "Dad, Mom, Victoria began, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something else I need to tell you about my time in Chicago and about Andrew." As Victoria prepared to reveal the whole truth, she knew this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. A battle that would determine not only her future, but the future of Morgan Enterprises, and possibly that of many other people whose lives were touched by the company's actions. What Victoria didn't know was that at that very moment, Richard Wallace was making a series of frantic calls, trying to control the damage and ensure that his plans didn't crumble before he could put them into action. "I need you to delay the board meeting," Richard ordered his assistant. "Make up an excuse, whatever, I need time to handle this." Meanwhile, in the Morgans' dining room, Victoria took a deep breath and began her explanation. "Mom, Dad, Andrew is not just a friend I met in Chicago. He is Andrew Grayson, son of Charles Grayson, the CEO of Innovatech." The revelation fell like a bomb in the room. Frederick Morgan jumped to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "Charles Grayson's son? Our biggest competitor? Victoria, do you have any idea what this means?" Isabel Morgan, always the voice of reason, put a hand on her husband's arm. "Frederick, calm down. Let's let Victoria finish explaining." Andrew stepped forward, his posture erect and determined. "Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, I understand your concern, but I assure you that my intentions are sincere. Like Victoria, I too was looking for my own path, away from my family's expectations." Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength. "What Andrew and I discovered is that we have much more in common than we thought, and together we believe we can do something really good, not just for our companies, but for society in general." Frederick ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "Victoria, business is not a fairy tale. You can't just decide to change everything overnight based on a summer romance." "It's not a summer romance, Dad," Victoria replied firmly. "It's a shared vision of what our companies could be. Andrew and I have been discussing ideas on how Morgan Enterprises and Innovatech could collaborate on projects that benefit the community." Lucy, who had been watching silently, decided to intervene. "Mr. Morgan, if I may, I've seen firsthand how Victoria, or Sophie as I knew her, genuinely cares about others. Her ideas are not mere fantasies. They're well-thought-out plans that could make a real difference." Before Frederick could respond, the house phone rang. Martha hurriedly entered. "Sir, it's Mr. Wallace. He says it's urgent." Frederick took the call, his frown deepening as he listened. After a few moments, he hung up and turned to the group. "The board meeting has been postponed until tomorrow. Apparently, several members have unavoidable commitments today." His tone made it clear he didn't believe that excuse. Victoria exchanged a look with Andrew. They both knew this gave them one more day to prepare, but it also meant that the forces opposing them were mobilizing. "All right," said Victoria, straightening up. "Then we'll use this time to prepare even better. Dad, Mom, I know you have doubts, but I ask you to listen to us. Let us present our ideas to you. If after that you still think we're wrong, I'll accept it." Frederick and Isabel looked at each other, communicating silently as only couples who have been together for decades can do. Finally, Frederick nodded. "Okay, you have until dinner to prepare your presentation. We'll listen with an open mind." As Victoria, Andrew, and Lucy withdrew to work on their presentation, Andrew's phone vibrated with a message. It was from his father, Charles Grayson. "Son, what the hell is going on? You're on every news channel with the Morgan girl. Call me immediately." Andrew sighed, knowing he would have to face his own family battle very soon. Throughout the day, the trio worked tirelessly on their presentation, refining their ideas and preparing for any questions or objections they might face. Victoria was surprised at how much she had learned during her time in Chicago and how her perspective on the family business had changed. Meanwhile, in the offices of Morgan Enterprises, Richard Wallace was having his own secret meeting with Jason Miller. "I need you to discredit Victoria and that Grayson boy," Richard ordered. "Use your media contacts. Insinuate that their romance is just a ploy for a hostile takeover of Innovatech. Do whatever it takes to sow doubt." Jason smiled maliciously. "It will be my pleasure, sir. I have some more photos that could be interesting if taken out of context." As the sun began to set over New York City, Victoria, Andrew, and Lucy prepared to present their ideas to the Morgans. What they didn't know was that, while they were preparing to change the future of Morgan Enterprises for the better, other forces were working in the shadows to ensure that never happened. Dinner was served at the Morgan mansion, but no one was really interested in the food. The tension in the air was palpable as Victoria and Andrew stood up to begin their presentation. "Dad, Mum," Victoria began, her voice firm despite her nerves, "we know that what we're going to propose may sound radical at first, but we ask you to listen with an open mind." Andrew continued, "What we propose is a new direction for Morgan Enterprises, one that will not only increase long-term profitability, but will also have a significant positive impact on society." For the next hour, Victoria and Andrew presented their vision of a socially responsible company. They talked about training, programs for disadvantaged communities, investments in clean technologies, and a restructuring of the supply chain to prioritize ethical and sustainable suppliers. Frederick and Isabel listened in silence, their expressions unreadable. When the presentation ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Finally, Frederick spoke. "I must admit, I'm impressed by the depth of your analysis. But have you considered the short-term costs of these initiatives? Shareholders won't be happy if they see a drop in dividends." Victoria was prepared for this question. "We've considered it, Dad. Our calculations show that although there will be an initial decrease in profits, in the long term these initiatives will not only improve our public image but also open up new markets and business opportunities." Isabel, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Victoria, Andrew, your vision is admirable. But how do you plan to handle internal resistance? Changing the culture of such a large company won't be easy." Andrew responded, "We have a detailed plan for the gradual implementation of these changes, Mrs. Morgan. It includes employee training programs and an internal communication campaign to ensure everyone understands and commits to the new direction of the company." As the discussion continued, Frederick's phone rang. He frowned when he saw the name on the screen. Richard Wallace. "Excuse me, I have to take this," he said, leaving the room. Minutes later, Frederick returned, his face grim. "Victoria, Andrew, I'm afraid we have a problem. I just received news that several of our major shareholders are concerned about rumors of a possible hostile takeover attempt by Innovatech." Victoria and Andrew looked at each other, surprised. "But that's ridiculous," Victoria exclaimed. "We would never do something like that." Frederick sighed heavily. "I know, daughter, but the rumors are circulating and the market is nervous. If we don't handle this carefully, we could face a significant drop in our stock value." Andrew, realizing the gravity of the situation, spoke up. "Mr. Morgan, I think I know who might be behind these rumors. My father sent me a message today, asking about the news about Victoria and me. It's possible that someone is trying to create a conflict between our families." Victoria, feeling the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together, added, "And I think I know who might benefit from that conflict." Before she could elaborate, Martha rushed into the room, the TV remote in her hand. "Sir, ma'am, I think you should see this." She turned on the TV, tuning to a business news channel on the screen. A reporter spoke urgently. In a surprising twist, anonymous sources within Morgan Enterprises suggest that the recent reappearance of Victoria Morgan could be part of a broader strategy by Innovatech to gain control over the company. Images of the Morgan heiress with the son of Innovatech's CEO have led to speculation about a possible forced corporate marriage. Frederick turned off the TV, his face a mask of contained fury. "This is a disaster. We need to issue a press release immediately to deny these rumors." Victoria, however, had another idea. "No, Dad. This could be our opportunity." Everyone looked at her in surprise. Victoria continued, "Instead of denying the rumors, what if we use them to our advantage? Let's call a press conference for tomorrow. Andrew and I will announce our vision for a collaboration between Morgan Enterprises and Innovatech, not an acquisition, but a strategic alliance to drive corporate social responsibility initiatives." Andrew nodded, understanding Victoria's strategy. It's risky, but it could work if we present a united front and explain our true intentions. We could turn this crisis into an opportunity." Frederick and Isabel exchanged glances, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of this bold strategy. "It's dangerous," Frederick finally said, "but it could also be brilliant. All right, let's do it." As the Morgan family and their allies prepared for their risky move elsewhere in the city, Richard Wallace received the news of the imminent press conference with a mixture of rage and panic. "Damn it!" he shouted, throwing his phone against the wall. His plans were crumbling, and he knew he would have to take drastic measures if he wanted to maintain his position and prevent his own secrets from coming to light. As night fell over New York City, the various players in this corporate drama prepared for a battle that would determine not only the future of Morgan Enterprises, but also the balance of power in the American business world. Victoria, lying in her bed but unable to sleep, looked out the window at the city lights. She knew that tomorrow would be the most important day of her life, a day that would define not only her future, but that of many people who depended on Morgan Enterprises. With determination in her eyes, she promised herself that, no matter what happened, she would fight with all her might for the vision she believed in, a vision of a more ethical, more responsible, and more humane business world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the American corporate world. And at the center of it all, a young woman who had found her purpose and was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. The morning of the press conference dawned with a leaden sky over New York City, as if nature itself sensed the storm that was about to break in the corporate world. Victoria woke up before dawn, her mind already racing with the events ahead. She dressed carefully, choosing a suit that gave her an air of authority without losing her youth. As she looked in the mirror, she saw not just the heiress to an empire, but a woman with a mission. In the dining room, she found her father already awake, reviewing documents with a cup of coffee in hand. Frederick looked up as she entered. "Are you ready for this, Victoria?" he asked, his voice a mixture of concern and pride. She nodded, sitting across from him. "I am, Dad. I know it's risky, but I believe in what we're doing." Frederick looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You know, when you disappeared, I felt lost, not just from worry, but because I realized how much I depended on you for the future of the company. Now I see that you needed that time to become the leader. I always knew you could be." Her father's words moved her deeply. "Thank you, Dad. I promise I won't let you down." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Andrew faced his own family battle. He had spent the night in a hotel, avoiding returning to the Grayson mansion, but he knew he couldn't postpone the confrontation with his father any longer. Charles Grayson was waiting for him in his study, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "Have you lost your mind, Andrew? Do you have any idea of the damage you've done to our family, to our company?" Andrew stood firm. "Dad, I know this seems crazy, but if you listen to me, you'll see that what Victoria and I are proposing could be revolutionary for both companies." "Revolutionary?" Charles spat. "All I see is my son fraternizing with the enemy? Do you think Frederick Morgan is going to allow his precious heiress to marry his biggest competitor's son?" "This isn't about a corporate marriage, Dad," Andrew replied calmly. "It's about a shared vision for the future of our companies and of America. If you come to the press conference today, you'll understand." Charles looked at him skeptically, but something in his son's determination made him hesitate. "All right, I'll go to that press conference. But I warn you, Andrew, if this is some kind of trick—" "It's not, Dad, I promise you." As the Morgan and Grayson families prepared for the conference in the offices of Morgan Enterprises, Richard Wallace was in full crisis mode. He had spent the night trying to control the damage, but he knew his options were running out. "I need you to find something, anything, that we can use against Victoria or that Grayson boy," he ordered Jason on the phone. "I don't care how you do it, but do it fast." As the time for the conference approached, the media gathered in front of Morgan Enterprises headquarters. Speculation was at its peak, with theories ranging from a corporate merger to a family scandal. Victoria, Andrew, and their respective families arrived separately, carefully avoiding any contact in front of the cameras. Lucy, who had insisted on being present for moral support, mingled among the crowd of journalists, her heart beating with a mixture of excitement and fear for her friends inside the building, in a conference room prepared. For the event, Victoria and Andrew had a moment alone before facing the press. "Are you ready for this?" Andrew asked, taking Victoria's hands in his. She nodded, her gaze full of determination. "I am. Whatever happens, I know we're doing the right thing." They looked at each other for a moment, and without thinking, they melted into a passionate kiss. It was a kiss of promise, of mutual support, of a future worth fighting for. What they didn't know was that Jason, who had infiltrated among the security personnel, had captured that intimate moment with his camera. With a malicious smile, he sent the image to Richard Wallace. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doors of the conference room opened. Victoria and Andrew entered, followed by Frederick Morgan, and to many surprise, Charles Grayson. The press murmur intensified at this unexpected alliance. Victoria approached the podium, her posture erect and confident. "Good morning, everyone. We appreciate your presence at this press conference. We are here to clarify the rumors that have been circulating and to announce a new direction for Morgan Enterprises and Innovatech." She paused, her eyes scanning the room full of eager journalists. Contrary to speculation, there is no hostile takeover attempt. What Andrew Grayson and I propose is a strategic alliance between our companies, a collaboration that will not only benefit both companies, but will also have a positive impact on American society. The murmur in the room grew, Victoria continued, explaining her vision of corporate social responsibility, investments in clean technologies, and community development programs. As she spoke, you could see how some journalists went from skeptical curiosity to genuine interest. Andrew took over, detailing how this alliance would allow both companies to innovate in areas that previously seemed out of reach. Together, we can be more than the sum of our parts. We can be an example of how the private sector can be an engine of positive change in society. As the presentation continued, Richard Wallace watched from the back of the room, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He knew that if this alliance materialized, his position in the company would be in danger. He needed to act, and fast. Just as Victoria and Andrew were about to open the round of questions, Richard approached a journalist in the front row, whispering something in his ear. The journalist, known for his aggressiveness, immediately raised his hand. "Victoria, Andrew, you talk about social responsibility and transparency, but how do you expect us to believe in your vision when you yourselves have been deceiving everyone? We have information that your supposed strategic alliance is actually a cover for a secret romance that could compromise the integrity of both companies." A stunned silence fell over the room. Victoria and Andrew exchanged a quick glance. Aware that this was the moment that would define everything, Victoria took a deep breath and approached the microphone. "It's true that Andrew and I have a personal relationship. It's not something we tried to hide, but something we wanted to address at the right time. But let me be clear, our personal relationship does not compromise our professional vision. On the contrary, it has allowed us to see beyond traditional corporate rivalry and visualize a future where collaboration triumphs over destructive competition." Andrew nodded, adding, "We understand that this may seem like a conflict of interest, but we assure you that we have been completely transparent with our respective boards of directors. Our alliance proposal is based on solid business principles and a shared vision for the future of our companies and America." The room erupted into a frenzy of questions and camera flashes. Frederick Morgan and Charles Grayson, who until that moment had remained silent, approached the podium. Frederick spoke first. "As president of Morgan Enterprises, I can assure you that I have personally reviewed every aspect of this alliance proposal. It is not a decision taken lightly or influenced by personal matters. It is a solid strategy that we believe will benefit not only our companies, but the entire community." Charles Grayson, still visibly uncomfortable but determined, added, "Innovatech prides itself on its track record of innovation. This alliance with Morgan Enterprises will allow us to take that innovation to new levels, especially in areas of social responsibility and sustainability." As the press conference continued, With Victoria and Andrew answering questions with a mixture of professionalism and passion, Richard Wallace slipped out of the room, his mind working frantically on a new plan. He knew he had underestimated Victoria and Andrew, but he still wasn't willing to give up. In the following hours, social media and news outlets exploded with the news. Opinions were divided. Some saw the alliance as a bold and progressive move, while others considered it a risky ploy, motivated by a youthful romance. That night, at the Morgan mansion, Victoria, Andrew, Lucy, and the Morgan and Grayson families gathered for a tense but hopeful dinner. The ice between the two families was slowly beginning to melt, united by the common desire to see their children succeed. "I never thought I'd say this," Charles Grayson commented, raising his glass, "but I think our children might have discovered something truly revolutionary." Frederick nodded, clinking his glass with Charles's. "It seems the new generation has a lot to teach us, after all." As the families began to relax and discuss the possibilities of the alliance, Victoria slipped out to the balcony for a moment of tranquility. Andrew followed her, finding her, looking at the city lights. "We did it," he said softly, wrapping his arms around her. Victoria leaned back against him, exhausted but happy. "Yes, we did. But this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Andrew nodded. "The road ahead won't be easy, but I'm excited to walk it with you." They kissed under the stars, not knowing that this moment of triumph was just the calm before an even greater storm that was approaching. Meanwhile, in his luxurious penthouse, Richard Wallace looked at the city with cold fury. His phone rang, and as he answered, a grave and threatening voice filled the line. "Things are getting out of control, Wallace. If you can't handle that girl and her boyfriend, we'll have to take more definitive measures." Richard swallowed hard, aware that his web of lies and manipulations was about to close in on him. "Understood," he replied. "I'll take care of it, personally." As he hung up the phone, Richard knew he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. But with his secrets in danger of being exposed and his power rapidly vanishing, he was willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain his position, no matter the cost. The night advanced, and while Victoria and Andrew celebrated their first great triumph, the forces opposing them plotted in the shadows. The stage was set for a battle that would not only decide the future of Morgan Enterprises and Innovatech, but would also test the love, loyalty, and values of everyone involved. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity for Victoria and Andrew. The offices of Morgan Enterprises and Innovatech became a hive of meetings, presentations, and negotiations as the two companies worked to shape their revolutionary alliance. Victoria found herself immersed in a world of contracts, financial projections, and strategic plans. Despite the exhaustion, she felt more alive than ever. Every time she saw an opportunity to implement one of her social responsibility ideas, she felt that all her effort was worth it. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in her new office at Morgan Enterprises, Lucy entered with a worried expression. "Vic, you have to see this," she said. Handing her a tablet on the screen, a well-known investigative journalist was giving an interview. "We have received information from anonymous sources suggesting that the alliance between Morgan Enterprises and Innovatech may not be as benevolent as we're being led to believe. There are indications that this union could result in massive layoffs and the closure of several production plants in economically vulnerable areas." Victoria felt her blood run cold. "But that's not true. Our plans include creating new jobs and revitalizing those communities." Lucy nodded. "I know, but someone is leaking false information to the press, and it's gaining traction on social media." Before they could discuss further, Andrew burst into the office, his face pale. "Victoria, we have a problem. I just got a call from one of our main investors. He's threatening to withdraw his support. Due to the layoff rumors." Victoria stood up, her mind working at full speed. "This is not a coincidence. Someone is trying to sabotage our alliance." "Richard Wallace," Andrew muttered, his eyes meeting Victoria's. She nodded. "We need to talk to my father and yours. We need a plan to counter these lies before they cause more damage." As they hurriedly left the office, they didn't notice the figure watching them from across the hallway. Jason Miller smiled to himself, satisfied that his disinformation campaign was bearing fruit. In the main boardroom, Frederick Morgan and Charles Grayson were already waiting, their faces tense with concern. "This is a disaster," Charles growled. "I knew this alliance was too good to be true." Frederick raised a hand to calm him. "Before jumping to conclusions, let's hear what Victoria and Andrew have to say." Victoria took the floor, her voice firm, despite the pressure. "Dad, Mr. Grayson, these rumors are completely false. Someone is trying to sabotage our alliance by spreading lies. And do you have proof of this?" Charles asked, skeptical. Andrew intervened. "Not yet, but we think Richard Wallace might be behind this. He's been acting suspiciously since we announced the alliance." Frederick frowned. "Those are very serious accusations. Richard has been a loyal employee for years." "I know, Dad," Victoria said. "But think about it. Who else would have access to the inside information and the contacts necessary to orchestrate something like this?" Before anyone could respond, the door to the room burst open. It was Emma, Victoria's friend from Chicago, who had been working as an intern in the Corporate Social Responsibility Department. "Victoria, sorry for the interruption, but you have to see this," she exclaimed, handing her a folder. Victoria opened the folder and her eyes widened as she read its contents. This is incredible, Emma. Where did you find it?" Emma smiled, proud. "I was reviewing some old files for the Community Revitalization Project, and I stumbled upon this. They're records of suspicious transactions made by Morgan Enterprises years ago, all approved by Richard Wallace." Frederick jumped to his feet. "Let me see that." He took the folder and began to leaf through the documents, his face paling as he read. "This can't be," he muttered. "Embezzlement, bribes to officials. How could this happen under our noses?" Charles Grayson, who had been watching silently, finally spoke. "If this is true, it not only explains why Wallace is trying to sabotage the alliance, but it could also be enough to bring him down." Victoria looked at Andrew, a spark of hope in awe. Her eyes, "This is what we needed. With this information, we can expose Wallace and stop his disinformation campaign." Andrew nodded, but his expression remained cautious. "Yes, but we have to be careful. If Wallace finds out we have this, he might do something desperate." Frederick ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. "I can't believe I was so blind. Richard was like a brother to me." Victoria approached her father and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault. Dad Wallace deceived everyone, but now we have the opportunity to make things right." Charles Grayson stood up. "Well, what's the plan? We can't just go to the press with this. We need to handle it in a way that doesn't damage the reputation of our companies." "I have an idea," said Andrew, "but it's risky." All eyes turned to him as he explained his plan. As he spoke, a mixture of amazement and concern was reflected on the faces of those present. "It's dangerous," Victoria said when Andrew finished, "but it could work." Frederick and Charles exchanged glances. "It's a big risk," Frederick said, "but I think we have no other choice." As the group discussed the details of the plan in his office, Richard Wallace received a call that would leave him frozen. "Mr. Wallace," said a distorted voice on the other end of the line, "we have a problem. It seems someone has discovered the records of the transactions from 5 years ago." Wallace felt the ground open up beneath his feet. "How is that possible? Those records were destroyed." "Apparently not all of them," the voice replied, "and they're in the hands of Victoria Morgan and her group." Wallace hung up the phone, his mind working frantically. He knew that if those documents came to light, everything he had worked for would come crashing down. He would not only lose his position at Morgan Enterprises, but would probably end up in jail. With trembling hands, he opened his desk drawer and took out a gun. He looked at it for a long moment, considering his options. Finally, he made a decision. "If I'm going down," he muttered to himself, "I'm not going down alone." Meanwhile, Victoria and Andrew set their risky plan in motion. They knew they were playing with fire, but they also knew it was their best chance to save not only the alliance, but also to expose the corruption that had been lurking in the shadows of Morgan Enterprises for years. What they didn't know was that Richard Wallace, cornered and desperate, was about to take extreme measures that would endanger not only their careers but their lives. That night, as the city prepared to sleep, A storm was brewing on the horizon. Both literally and figuratively, thunder rumbled in the distance, like an omen of the dramatic events that were about to unfold. At the Morgan mansion, Victoria prepared for the most dangerous part of the plan. She was about to face Richard Wallace head-on, armed only with her intelligence and the truth. Andrew, standing in her bedroom doorway, watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Victoria turned to him, her eyes shining with determination. "I have to do it, Andrew. It's the only way to end this once and for all." They hugged tightly, aware that the next few hours could change their lives forever. As Victoria headed to the offices of Morgan Enterprises for her encounter with Wallace, Andrew and Lucy, prepared to execute their part of the plan. They had to ensure that the truth came to light, no matter what happened. What none of them knew was that Jason Miller, following Wallace's orders, had been following them. And now, hidden in the shadows, he prepared to intervene at the most critical moment. The storm finally broke over New York City, rain falling in sheets and lightning illuminating the night sky. It was as if the sky itself was anticipating the drama that was about to unfold in the offices of Morgan Enterprises. Victoria entered the building, her heart beating hard, but her face showing a calmness she didn't feel. She knew she was about to face not only Richard Wallace, but also a web of lies and corruption that had threatened to destroy everything she loved. As the elevator rose to the executive floor, Victoria mentally reviewed her plan. She had to get Wallace to confess, preferably on a recording. It was risky, but it was the only way to ensure that the truth came. To light, the elevator doors opened, and Victoria found herself face to face with Richard Wallace. For a moment, both stood still, staring at each other like two duelists sizing up their opponent before the final combat. "Victoria," Wallace said, his voice deceptively soft. "What a surprise to see you here so late." "I think we both know this isn't a surprise, Richard," Victoria replied, her voice firm. "It's time we talked." Wallace smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, come into my office." As they entered Wallace's luxurious office, the storm raged outside, lightning intermittently illuminating the room through the large windows. "So, Victoria," Wallace began, sitting behind his desk, "what do you want to talk about?" Victoria looked him directly in the eyes. "I know what you've been doing, Richard. The bribes, the embezzlement, your attempt to sabotage. Our alliance with Innovatech, it's over." For a moment, Wallace's mask slipped, revealing a mixture of surprise and fury, but he quickly regained his composure. "Those are very serious accusations, Victoria. I hope you have evidence to back them up." "I do," Victoria replied, pulling a folder from her bag, "and I'm willing to take it to the board of directors and the authorities if necessary." Wallace slowly stood up, circling his desk to approach Victoria. "And what do you hope to achieve with this? Do you think you can just walk in here and threaten me?" "It's not a threat, Richard. It's an opportunity. Confess your crimes, help us unravel this web of corruption, and maybe we can come to an agreement." Wallace laughed, a cold and humorless sound. "Oh, Victoria, so idealistic, so naive. Do you really think it's that simple?" As he spoke, Wallace approached a painting on the wall and moved it, revealing a hidden safe. He quickly opened it, and Victoria felt her heart stop when she saw what he took out. A gun. "I'm afraid you've made a grave mistake in coming here tonight," Wallace said, pointing the weapon at her. Victoria stepped back, her mind working frantically to find a way out. "Richard, think about what you're doing. There's no coming back from this." "There's no coming back for me, Victoria. You've destroyed everything I've worked for. But if I'm going to fall, I won't fall alone." At that moment, the office door burst open. Andrew ran in, followed closely by Jason Miller. "Victoria," Andrew shouted, quickly assessing the situation. Wallace, surprised by the interruption, turned the gun towards Andrew. Victoria took advantage of the distraction to lunge at Wallace, trying to disarm him. In the struggle that followed, the gun went off. The shot was drowned out by a particularly loud thunder. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The gunshot resonated in the office, mixing with the rumble of thunder outside Victoria. Andrew, Jason, and Wallace stood motionless, as if time had stopped. Then, slowly, Wallace staggered backward, a red stain spreading on his shirt. The gun fell from his hand, resonating on the marble floor. "No, it can't be," Wallace muttered, before collapsing to the floor. Victoria, snapping out of her stupor, ran towards him. "Call an ambulance," she shouted, pressing her hands against Wallace's wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Andrew was already on the phone, his voice urgent as he requested medical help. Jason, for his part, remained motionless, his face a mask of shock and horror. I didn't want to," Jason babbled. "I was just following orders. I didn't know he had a gun." Victoria looked at him, understanding dawning on her face. "It was you who fired." Jason nodded, dropping to his knees. I thought he was going to kill you. I reacted without thinking." As they waited for the ambulance to arrive, Wallace, his voice weak but still audible, began to speak. "Victoria," he murmured, "I'm sorry. I never wanted it to come to this." "Shh, don't talk," Victoria said, surprised by the compassion she felt for the man who moments before had threatened her life. "Help is on the way." "No," Wallace insisted. "You need to know there's more. I'm not the only one. The corruption, it goes beyond me." Andrew approached, taking out his phone. "I'm recording. Richard, tell us everything." With his last breath, Wallace began to reveal names, dates, transactions, a web of corruption that extended far beyond Morgan Enterprises, implicating politicians, judges, and other business leaders. When the paramedics finally arrived, Wallace had lost consciousness. But the recording on Andrew's phone contained a confession that would shake the foundations of the American business and political world. The following hours passed in a blur. The police arrived, taking statements and cordoning off the office. Victoria, Andrew, and Jason were taken to the police station for more detailed questioning. Frederick Morgan and Charles Grayson arrived shortly after, their faces a mixture of concern and relief to see that their children were safe. "Dad," Victoria said, hugging Frederick, "it's worse than we thought, much worse." Frederick nodded grimly. "I know. I've been listening to the news. It seems Wallace's confession has opened a Pandora's box." Indeed, as dawn broke over New York City, the headlines of every newspaper and news broadcast spoke of the Wallace scandal. The revelations of widespread corruption were shaking the entire country. Days later, Victoria found herself in her office at Morgan Enterprises, looking out the window at the city that seemed to have changed overnight. The streets were filled with protesters demanding justice and reforms. Andrew entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "How are you feeling?" he asked, offering her a cup. Victoria sighed, gratefully taking the coffee, overwhelmed, scared, but also hopeful. "Is that strange?" Andrew smiled, taking her hand. "No, it's not. We've uncovered something huge, something that could really change things." "But what if we can't handle the consequences?" Victoria asked. "Our companies, our families, everything is at risk." "We'll handle it," Andrew said confidently. "Together, and this time, we'll do it the right way." At that moment, Lucy and Emma entered the office, their faces animated despite the evident fatigue. "Guys, you have to see this," Lucy said, turning on the TV on the wall on the screen. A news anchor spoke enthusiastically. In a surprising twist, the heirs of Morgan Enterprises and Innovatech, Victoria Morgan and Andrew Grayson, have announced an unprecedented initiative. In response to the corruption scandal, they are proposing a new business model based on total transparency and social responsibility. Victoria and Andrew looked at each other, a mixture of pride and determination in their eyes. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew they were doing the right thing. "Are you ready for this?" Emma asked, looking at the couple. Victoria nodded, squeezing Andrew's hand. "More than ever. It's time to really change things." As the sun rose over New York City, illuminating a city on the threshold of change, Victoria and Andrew prepared to face their greatest challenge yet. They not only had to save their companies and clear their names, but they also had the opportunity to be the catalysts for real change in the way business was done in America. The storm had passed, but the ripples it had created would continue to expand for a long time, and at the center of it all, a young and determined couple ready to face whatever came. Together, epilogue. 6 months later, the auditorium was packed to the brim, Journalists, business people, politicians, and ordinary citizens had gathered to witness what many were calling the new dawn of American business. Victoria Morgan and Andrew Grayson took the stage hand in hand, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and hope. 6 months. Haggis, Victoria began, her voice firm and clear. Our country was shaken by revelations of corruption that reached the highest levels of government and business. Today, we are here to demonstrate that there is another way. Andrew continued. The alliance between Morgan Enterprises and Innovatech is not just a business merger, it's a commitment to transparency, social responsibility, and sustainable development. As they detailed their plans, which ranged from community development programs to innovative clean technologies, the auditorium listened in reverent silence among the audience. Frederick Morgan and Charles Grayson watched with pride. Lucy and Emma, now an integral part of the leadership team, smiled from the front row. Even Jason Miller was present, having decided to fully cooperate with the authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. At the end of the presentation, the ovation was deafening. Victoria and Andrew embraced on stage, aware that this was just the beginning of a long journey, but feeling more prepared than ever to face it. As they left the auditorium, surrounded by an enthusiastic crowd, Victoria turned to Andrew. You know, when I left my life of luxury to live as a common student in Chicago, I never imagined it would end up like this. Andrew smiled, gently kissing her forehead. Life has an interesting way of taking us exactly where we need to be. And as they walked towards the future they had forged together, Victoria knew that, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. The sun was setting over New York City, bathing the city in a golden glow that seemed to promise a brighter tomorrow, and at the heart of that promise were Victoria and Andrew, two young people who dared to dream of a better world and had the courage to make that dream a reality.